At 10 o'clock on the morning of October 29, 1941, Junior Lieutenant Boris Kovzan sat in the freezing cockpit of his Polikarpov I-16, watching his ammunition counter fall to zero. He was flying over the town of Zarikai, just southeast of Moscow, and he was in the middle of a disaster. The temperature outside was 30 degrees below zero, cold enough to turn engine oil into sludge and freeze the moisture in a man's eyes. But Kovzan wasn't cold. He was sweating inside his leather flight suit because 50 yards ahead of him flew a Heinkel He-111 that refused to die. The German bomber was a twin-engine beast, a flying fortress of corrugated metal and machine gun turrets, carrying 2,000 pounds of high explosives meant for the Soviet infantry digging trenches in the frozen mud below. Kovzan had done everything the manual told him to do. He had approached from the sun. He had closed the distance until the black German crosses filled his windshield. He had squeezed the trigger and poured hundreds of rounds of 7.62 mm steel into the enemy fuselage. He watched his tracers spark and ricochet off German armor like gravel thrown against a tin roof. The Heinkel was built like a tank. Kovzan's guns were simply too small to crack it open. And now they were silent. The violent vibration that had shaken his airframe for the past 30 seconds vanished, replaced by the steady, almost mocking drone of his engine. Inside the bomber, the German tail gunner saw the Soviet fighter's muzzle flashes stop. He saw the small green aircraft bank slightly, its nose clean, its threat seemingly ended. The gunner probably relaxed. Maybe he loosened his grip on the spade handles of his machine gun. Maybe he allowed himself a breath. The fight was over. That was how air combat worked. You shoot, you miss, you go home to reload. It was an unspoken agreement written into the laws of physics. Without bullets, you were no longer a soldier. You were a spectator. But Boris Kovzan had no interest in the agreement. He looked at the Heinkel cruising arrogantly toward his capital city. He looked at the black exhaust smoke trailing behind its engines. Then he looked at the nose of his own aircraft. The I-16 was not a beautiful machine. Soviet pilots nicknamed it Ishak, the donkey, because it was stubborn, loud, and difficult to handle. It was outdated, partly wood and fabric, with an open cockpit that let the Russian winter cut straight through a man's bones. But bolted to the front of its 9-cylinder engine was something very interesting. A solid steel propeller. 9 feet of hardened metal spinning at 2,000 revolutions per minute. To an engineer, it was propulsion. To Kovzan, sitting there with empty guns and a heart full of fury, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a buzzsaw. The manual was clear. Mid-air contact meant death. A collision would shatter the propeller, rip the engine from its mounts, and send the pilot tumbling to earth in a fireball. Kovzan gripped the throttle. He didn't turn back. He pushed it forward. To understand why a 21-year-old pilot would turn his aircraft into a kinetic weapon, you have to look at the scoreboard. 5 months earlier, the German Wehrmacht had smashed into the Soviet Union, and the Luftwaffe had swept the skies clean. German pilots flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109 dominated the air. The aircraft climbed like a rocket, moved with terrifying speed, and carried 20mm cannons capable of blowing a Soviet fighter apart with a single burst. They were veterans of London and Paris. They flew in flexible formations, communicating through high-quality radios, coordinating attacks like wolves. They looked at the Soviet Air Force and laughed. The I-16 was a relic of the 1930s. Most had no radios. Soviet pilots communicated by waggling wings and waving through frost-covered glass while German fighters stalked them over the wireless. In the first week of the invasion, the Luftwaffe destroyed nearly 4,000 Soviet aircraft. Many still parked neatly on their airfields. They strafed pilots as they ran across tarmacs. The experts in Berlin, London, and Washington agreed. The Soviet Air Force was finished. That humiliation created a special kind of psychology. When you know the enemy is faster, better armed, and better trained, you stop worrying about survival. You stop obsessing over tactics. You begin operating on spite. Soviet pilots knew they could not outturn or outclimb the Germans. So they decided to outcrazy them. They flew in blizzards that grounded German aircraft. They took off from mud strips that would snap the landing gear of delicate enemy fighters. They refused to quit, even when the math said they were already dead. By October 1941, an unwritten rule had formed in the Red Air Force. If you have bullets, shoot. If you don't have bullets, hit them. Just don't let the bombs fall. Back over Zerikai, the German tail gunner believed the threat was gone. He didn't see the E-shock sliding into his blind spot, tucked beneath the bomber's tail, fighting the violent turbulence pouring off the larger aircraft. The air was brutal, tossing Kovzan's fighter like a leaf in a storm. He had to be precise. This wasn't a crash. This was surgery at 300 miles per hour. If he struck the bomber's main fuselage, the larger mass would crush him instantly. He needed the weak points, the rudder and elevators, the fragile control surfaces that kept the heavy bomber stable. 10 yards. 5. The spinning disc of his propeller was now inches from the bomber's tail wheel. He could see rivets in the metal skin. He could smell exhaust fumes burning his throat. The experts said it was impossible. The impact would shear the drive shaft. Debris would tear through the cockpit. The loss of airspeed would send him spinning to his death. Kovzan didn't consult the experts. He thought about the bombs in that belly. He thought about the soldiers below. He waited for the bomber to level out. He pulled back gently on the stick and shoved the throttle forward. The I-16 surged upward. The propeller didn't tap the tail. It devoured it. The sky erupted with the screech of tearing metal, a sound like a freight train derailing mid-air. The violent impact slammed Kovzan against his harness, bruising his shoulders. Oil and hydraulic fluid sprayed across his windshield. For a split second, the two aircraft were fused together, wood and aluminum locked in a screaming embrace. Then they separated. The bomber pitched violently upward, its tail section shredded, its rudder hanging by twisted cables. Without control, the massive aircraft became a falling brick. It rolled onto its wing and began a spiraling dive toward the white Russian earth. Kovzan wrestled his own shaking machine. His propeller blades were bent like broken fingers. The engine coughed and rattled, but it was still running. The wings were still attached. He watched the Heinkel vanish into the snow below. Seconds later, a mushroom of fire bloomed where it struck, its bombs detonating on impact. Kovzan checked his altitude, checked his oil pressure. He was still flying. The suicide attack hadn't killed him. He was alive. It hadn't killed him. It had transformed him into something far more dangerous. A pilot who understood he didn't need bullets to win. Boris Kovzan nursed his crippled Polikarpov I-16 back toward the airfield. The bent propeller clawed at the frozen ground as he landed on the rough dirt strip, kicking up clouds of icy earth. When he taxied to a stop and climbed out, the ground crew froze in place. The nose of the aircraft looked like it had been chewed by a steel monster. Mechanics ran their hands over the twisted propeller blades, staring at Kovzan with disbelief. "Was it an accident?" they asked. "Did you collide in the clouds?" Kovzan pulled off his leather helmet, wiped oil from his face, and lit a cigarette. "It wasn't an accident," he told them. "It's a tactic. As long as the engine is turning," he added, "I'm never out of ammunition." The mechanics looked at the wrecked propeller. Then they looked at the column of black smoke still drifting on the horizon where the Heinkel He-111 had fallen. Something had changed. The Germans had better technology. They had faster aircraft. But they didn't have this. They didn't have pilots willing to turn themselves into weapons. The report climbed the chain of command. Soviet generals read it skeptically. German intelligence officers dismissed it as a desperate fluke, a frightened young pilot making a suicidal mistake. They were wrong. It wasn't a fluke. It was a rehearsal. Kovzan had rediscovered the ancient tactic of Taran, the aerial ram, and he was just getting started. The engineers versus the pilot. At the airfield, the mechanics examined the damage. This wasn't a repair job, it was an autopsy. The propeller blades were curled backward like peeled fruit. The engine cowling was crushed inward. The main bearings were likely pulverized. To engineers, this was madness. A propeller was a precisely balanced instrument designed to move air, not slice through the steel tail of a bomber. They filed reports calling the maneuver unauthorized and suicidal. They warned Kovzan that physics would eventually collect its debt. But Kovzan wasn't thinking like an engineer. He replayed the collision in his mind. It hadn't been a random crash. It had been controlled destruction. The German bomber had been heavy and stable, flying straight and level. His fighter had been lighter, agile, attacking from the rear. By targeting the fragile control surfaces, the rudder and elevators, he hadn't smashed into a wall. He had kicked the legs out from under a giant. The damage to his aircraft was severe. The damage to the enemy was fatal. He realized something profound. The propeller was a weapon that never jammed, never overheated, never ran out of rounds. It just needed a pilot willing to use it. The second ram. Winter deepened. Snow piled onto runways. Mechanics lit fires under engines just to make them turn. The Luftwaffe continued flying confidently, believing the Soviets were broken. Kovzan was hunting. Months later, during another engagement, his guns failed again. The details blur in reports, but the result was clear. He found himself behind a Junkers Ju-88, a fast and deadly German bomber. The tail gunner sprayed bullets, forcing him back. Any sane pilot would have disengaged. Kovzan pushed the throttle forward. He knew the drill. He closed the gap, ignored tracers ripping past his canopy, and lined up the nose of his I-16 with the bomber's tail. No hesitation, no prayer, just execution. The propeller tore through the control surfaces with surgical precision. The Ju-88 flipped violently and plunged from the sky. Kovzan returned, again alive. 2 rams, 2 kills, 2 survivals. It was no longer luck. It was doctrine. German pilots began hearing rumors in their barracks. Stories of mad Russians who would ram you rather than let you escape. It changed how they flew. When a Soviet fighter got too close, panic replaced precision. Psychological armor began to crack. The third strike. In 1942, Kovzan transitioned to the modern Yakovlev Yak-1. It was faster, better armed, finally competitive with the German Messerschmitt Bf 109. But old habits remained. During a chaotic dogfight in July 1942, his guns ran dry again while chasing a Bf 109. The German pilot attempted to reverse the engagement, trying to slip behind him. Kovzan didn't allow it. He shoved the throttle forward and aimed not for the tail, but for the wing. The impact sheared the German fighter apart. 3 rams, 3 kills, 3 survivals. Doctors called him the luckiest man in the Soviet Union. They warned him the law of averages was coming. Kovzan ignored them. August 13, 1942. Near Staraya Russa, Kovzan was alone. He spotted aircraft in the distance. 6 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. A trap. 6 experienced German pilots flying a deadly formation designed to isolate and destroy a single target. The logical move was to dive and run. Kovzan climbed. He flew directly into the center of the formation. The Germans scattered, assuming it was a suicide charge. They were half right. The sky erupted in tracers and cannon fire. His Yak was shredded. A 20mm shell struck his engine. Oil sprayed across the windscreen. Flames licked the cowling. His canopy shattered. His guns were silent. He was choking inside a burning aircraft. Through smoke and oil, he saw the lead German fighter lining up head-on for the kill. Kovzan didn't dodge. He aimed. This wouldn't be a tail chop. This would be a head-on collision at a combined speed of nearly 600 miles per hour. The German pilot realized too late. The 2 aircraft met in a flash of catastrophic physics. This wasn't a crash. It was an explosion of energy. Engines disintegrated. Propellers became shrapnel. Fuel vaporized in a blinding white flash. The German fighter ceased to exist, reduced to fragments raining over the forest below. Kovzan should have died with him. But physics can be unpredictable. The force of the impact didn't crush him. It ejected him. His canopy was already shattered. The explosion sheared his seat bolts loose and hurled him from the cockpit like a rag doll thrown from a speeding vehicle. He fell into open sky, bruised, burned, bleeding, but alive. 1 second he was gripping the control stick, staring straight into the face of death. The next, he was tumbling through the freezing sky, surrounded by the shattered debris of his own aircraft. He was alive, but he was falling. And he was falling from 18,000 feet. Kovzan remained conscious as he dropped, plummeting toward the earth at terminal velocity, nearly 120 miles per hour. The experts would later call it a mathematical certainty of death. Kovzan just called it Tuesday. The freezing slipstream tore at his flight suit. The horizon spun wildly around him. Sky, ground, sky, ground. In a dizzying blur, instinct took over. Years of training kicked in. He reached for the ripcord and pulled. Nothing. The handle came away in his hand, but the parachute never deployed. The canister on his back had been shredded by German cannon fire during the dogfight. The silk was ripped apart. The lines were severed. He was falling with nothing but a backpack full of useless fabric. From that height, death does not come quickly. It gives you time to understand exactly what is happening. Kovzan tumbled through the clouds, falling past birds, falling past the fading sounds of battle. The roar of engines disappeared. The machine guns fell silent. There was only the rushing wind, a deafening roar like a waterfall in his ears. He looked down. The ground was no longer a map. It was a rushing wall of green and brown. He could see trees, rivers, marshland. He was a meteor of flesh and bone, accelerating toward an impact that should have turned him into nothing more than a crater. Most men would have fainted from terror. Most would have closed their eyes and waited for the end. Reports say Kovzan kept his eyes open. He did not scream. He did not pray. He simply fell, a tiny speck in the vast Russian sky, waiting for the laws of physics to complete the job the Luftwaffe had started. Below him was no runway, no open field. It was a swamp. The vast marshes of northwestern Russia are a nightmare for soldiers, but on that specific day, they were the only thing that could possibly save a falling man. The swamp was a thick, freezing mixture of mud, stagnant water, and dense reeds. It wasn't soft. Hitting water at 120 miles per hour is like hitting concrete. But it wasn't solid ground either. Kovzan struck the treetops first. Birch and pine branches whipped against him, tearing his suit, breaking ribs, slowing him by fractions of a second. They acted as a brutal, improvised braking system. He smashed through limbs as thick as a man's arm, tumbling through the green canopy before finally crashing into the swamp below. He didn't splash. He cratered. The mud swallowed him in a violent, crushing impact. The force shattered his right leg, broke his collarbone, cracked his skull, and knocked the air from his lungs. Muddy water filled his mouth. But he did not explode on impact. The trees had stolen his speed. The swamp absorbed the rest. The experts said a fall from 18,000 feet was fatal. The experts had never calculated the resistance of frozen Russian marshland. Kovzan lay half-buried in sludge, broken and bleeding. His aircraft was gone. The sky above was empty. The ripples in the water slowly faded. Birds began singing again. The war continued miles overhead, but down in the mud, there was only silence and the shallow, ragged breathing of a man who refused to die. Collective farm workers, partisans hiding in the forest, had seen debris falling from the sky. They expected to find a dead German or a dead Soviet pilot. They did not expect to find anything alive. They waded through chest-deep water, pushing aside reeds, searching. They found Kovzan face down in the mire. They pulled him out by his harness. His face was covered in blood and oil. His leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He wasn't moving. They laid him on dry ground. Caps came off. Some crossed themselves. They assumed they were looking at a corpse and began discussing where to bury him. Then the corpse opened its one good eye. Kovzan groaned. The partisans stumbled backward as if they had seen a ghost. A man who falls 4 miles without a parachute does not groan. He remains silent. But Kovzan was making noise. He was asking for water. He was trying to sit up. Shock turned into action. They built a stretcher from branches and coats and carried him for miles through the forest. Every step must have been agony. Bones grinding, wounds tearing. But he held on to consciousness with the same stubbornness that had once driven him to ram enemy aircraft out of the sky. He had not let the Germans kill him. He wasn't going to let a swamp finish the job. At the field hospital, the doctors took one look and shook their heads. The list of injuries read like a medical textbook. Shattered leg, broken arm, fractured ribs, internal bleeding, severe concussion, and one eye beyond saving. The surgeon asked how it happened. "He fell from the sky," the partisans said. The surgeon didn't believe them. It was medically impossible. He assumed the pilot had crashed and been thrown clear. But when they cut away his shredded flight suit, they found the evidence. The parachute pack was still strapped to his back. The ripcord had been pulled. The flaps were sealed shut, jammed by shrapnel and heat. The chute had never opened. The surgeon stared at the unopened pack. Then at the man still breathing on the table. The medical manuals said he should be dead. The physics manuals said he should be a stain in the swamp. Boris Kovzan was proving them wrong. The surgery lasted for hours. Bones were set. Wounds were stitched. The ruined eye was removed. Word spread through the corridors. The man who fell from the sky and lived. It sounded like propaganda, like a story invented to boost morale. But the evidence lay in bed number 4. Wrapped in bandages, chest rising and falling. Days later, when Kovzan finally regained consciousness in a hospital in Moscow, the world was blurred and distant. He had one eye left. His body felt crushed. A normal man would have been grateful simply to be alive. Boris Kovzan was not a normal man. His first question to the nurse was not, "Will I walk?" It was, "When can I fly?" The medical board declared him unfit for service. Career ending. A pilot cannot judge distance with one eye. They stamped his discharge papers in bold red letters. They thought they were doing him a favor. Kovzan tore the papers apart. He didn't want a pension. He didn't want sympathy. He wanted a cockpit. He trained himself to compensate, pouring water into a glass repeatedly to retrain depth perception, forcing his brain to adapt. He strengthened his shattered body. He argued, wrote letters, demanded a test flight. Finally, worn down by his persistence, a commander allowed him into a training aircraft, expecting failure. Kovzan climbed into the cockpit of a Polikarpov biplane. He looked down the runway with his single eye and pushed the throttle forward. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. He didn't just circle the field, he performed aerobatics. Loops, rolls. A flawless landing so gentle the wheels barely kissed the grass. He taxied back, shut down the engine, stepped out, and saluted. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He returned to the front in 1943, only 22 years old, flying the new Lavochkin La-5, one eye, broken bones healed, and a reputation that defied gravity itself. This was not the fragile wooden crate he had flown in 1941. This was a serious war machine, fast, powerful, and heavily armed. But the true weapon was the man in the cockpit. Boris Kovzan did not fly cautiously. He did not fly like someone who believed his luck had run out. He flew with cold, terrifying precision. Before the war ended, he shot down 6 more German aircraft, and this time he didn't need to ram them. He had already proven his point. The ramming attacks had never been suicide attempts. They were tools of last resort, weapons used when ammunition was gone and options had vanished. Now he had cannons. Now he had speed. So he used them. But the threat always lingered. German pilots knew his name. They understood that if they cornered him, if they forced him into a head-on pass, if they ran him out of ammunition, he would not surrender. He would simply turn his aircraft into a missile again. By 1944, the Luftwaffe had adjusted its tactics on the Eastern Front. German flight manuals carried urgent warnings. Avoid head-on engagements with Soviet fighters. The deadly game of chicken. 2 aircraft racing toward each other waiting for one pilot to flinch, no longer favored them. A German pilot flinched because he wanted to live. A Soviet pilot like Kovzan did not flinch because he viewed his aircraft as a bullet already fired. The psychological shift was profound. What began as mockery had turned into reluctant respect, even fear. The war ended in May 1945. The so-called Thousand-Year Reich had lasted only 12. The Soviet Air Force, written off as destroyed in 1941, was flying victory patrols over Berlin. On an airfield stood Boris Kovzan, hero of the Soviet Union, the Gold Star medal resting on his chest. He had survived the impossible. He had rammed for enemy aircraft. He had fallen 4 miles without a parachute. He had lost an eye, shattered bones throughout his body, and still returned to combat. The experts who said it could not be done had nothing left to say. The engineers who insisted physics would not allow survival were forced to reconsider. History was not rewritten in grand castles by distant generals. It was rewritten in mud and smoke by young men who refused to quit. Kovzan did not die in a cockpit. Men like him often survive the storm and quietly live out the calm that follows. After the war, he left the Air Force and returned to school. He married. He raised a family. He walked down ordinary streets like any other man. Passers-by had no idea that the quiet gentleman with the glass eye had once used his propeller to sever the tail of a bomber in midair. He did not boast. He did not haunt bars telling war stories. He simply lived. Boris Kovzan died in 1985. An old man, in a warm bed, surrounded by peace. In the end, that was his final victory. The enemy had thrown everything at him. Cannon fire, gravity, fire, and fate, and failed. He outlived the war. He outlived the Reich. He outlived the odds. Historians often focus on machines, horsepower, armor thickness, climb rates, turn radii. But wars are not won by specifications alone. They are won by people who refuse to accept that impossible means stop. Kovzan was just a 21-year-old kid when it began. He was cold. He was afraid. He did not want to die. He wanted to defend his home. And when he ran out of bullets, he did not consult a manual to see what was permitted. He did what had to be done. He turned himself into the weapon. We tell stories like this because it is easy to forget. Easy to look at black and white photographs and imagine those men were made of iron. They were not. They were human, frightened, flawed, determined. And when someone tells you that something is impossible, remember the pilot who fell 4 miles into a frozen swamp and came back to shoot down 6 more enemy aircraft. That is not mythology. That is will.